Well, hello everyone, and welcome to our third program in the video series from the Nurse Leader Coach. The title of this program is Coaching in a Time of Change and Chaos. I'm Dr. Rose Sherman, the author of the book, The Nurse Leader Coach, and I'll be your coach and facilitator and guide for this series. You know, when nurse leaders think about chaos and change, the need to be a leader coach might not be the top of mind thing for you during this time. You may feel like you are whitewater rafting in kind of a sea of uncertainty. But what we do know is that during times of chaos and change, these are the times that are the most difficult for your staff. So it's then during these times that they most need you to be their coach. So this is a really important topic for us to talk about. Now, this program is divided into three parts. So let's get started with part one. We'll be discussing the impact of chaos and change. What kind of an impact does it have on us? And what kind of an impact does it have on our staff? And then we'll talk about the key qualities that staff look for and need from their leaders during periods like this. Now, I think we can probably all agree that COVID-19 has really been an absolute game changer in healthcare. Now, at the time when I'm recording this, some of you may be in a hot spot where your hospital has literally been in crisis mode for weeks. Others may still be in the planning stage, and some may actually find themselves emerging from the crisis. What we do know is that during this pandemic, nurse leaders have really been working without a playbook because what's happened is absolutely unprecedented. We've had to move into really uncharted waters in a very volatile environment that's been really characterized by rapid and sudden changes. And you know, there's been a lot of uncertainty when we think about the guidelines, as an example, that have come out from CDC. There's a lot of uncertainty and accuracy, concern about the accuracy of information, and of course, what the projected outcomes are of the pandemic. So decision making, any decision making that we undertake during times of chaos and uncertainty is really fraught with complexity because there's a multiplicity of variables that we really need to think about. And at the same times, there's really so many unknowns. And, you know, there really is ambiguity moving forward from a lack of clarity about how this event will transform healthcare and possibly even how it will transform nursing. It's really produced a phenomenal level of disruption and a recognition that our future will probably be more unpredictable than our past. And it is very likely that our healthcare environments will never be the same. Now, some of the changes that you've probably experienced are outlined on this slide. I think as I think about what nurse leaders have talked to me about, some of the big areas have been the idea that staff have been redeployed because so many, postponement of elective surgeries and other procedures, and patients, frankly, not coming to the hospital unless they have COVID-19 or suspect they have the virus, that so many other clinical areas, the census and volumes have really dropped. So you've really been deploying staff to areas that are not in their area of expertise, and they may have great fears of harming patients. And, you know, there has also been shortages of PPD and changes in infection control practices. We know that we've had to convert some of our clinical areas into intensive care units, and our educators have had to do a lot of rapid cycle education around ventilator management, as an example. You know, what this opportunity or what this crisis has presented us with are some really unique conditions to think about and move more freely to create innovation in a way that we probably haven't done before. So, you know, a crisis also, however, makes us look at the vulnerabilities in our system and acknowledge some of our practices that maybe don't work very well in emergency situations. So, in the words of Apple, it gives us some space to think differently, and that's a really positive outcome. You know, today we hear the term the new normal. This is something that we're hearing all over the place, yet no one knows what that new normal will really look like. Because what has made this COVID-19 crisis so different than other emergency events like a hurricane or a tornado is that usually when you have one of these catastrophic events, you have it and then you have the aftermath. So it's a more discrete event. But here with the pandemic, you have this ongoing situation where there doesn't, we know where the beginning was, but we don't know where the middle is, and we certainly don't know where the end is. And this level of uncertainty has really been very difficult for staff and really presented leaders as well, nurse leaders with really unprecedented challenges. What we do know is that our brains really hate change. We feel much safer when we know what to expect. And that's why an environment like this creates so many challenges for us on an individual level, is because our brain is reacting to this idea that we're not psychologically safe. For some people, they're almost always in this continuous um, stress and anxiety state that really arises out of this fight or flight mechanism in their body. So these are the kind of pressures that we find ourselves under, and our staff as well. And what also happens during times of incredible change is that we are forced to really unlearn some of the practices that we've done before. And I think the whole area of our protective equipment, PPE, it serves as a really good example. What we learned in school about how to personally protect ourselves really never included reusing PPE. But in this crisis, we've had shortages. So consequently, there really have been new recommendations that have been issued by CDC and other agencies that are kind of reflective of what's happening in this crisis. For our staff and for ourselves, this has really required some unlearning of some best practices in the past and adopting practices that probably would have seemed very deviant even a few short months ago. When we add up all the change, that we may have in our practice, it becomes very, very challenging, because when you think about your work environment, our work is really a series of habits. We come to work, we get our coffee, we take report, we go out and we do an assessment of our patients. But now you have a completely different way in this COVID-19 environment that you've been forced to really work differently from the time that you arrive at work, what you have to do, and the time that you leave. Big changes. So changing our work habits is very uncomfortable, especially for those that where it may involve a fear of a loss of skills and status. Some areas like pediatrics and some of our ambulatory services and even perioperative, which we're going to talk about more a little later. These areas are not being heavily utilized right now, so people are being redeployed, and they worry about, this changes my whole persona of who I am, and my work habits as well. Um, and I think that most leaders also intuitively know that not all of our staff really view change or deal with change in the very same way. And so it's good to review Everett Rogers' theory of diffusion of innovation and change. And you can see how people react to change is really more on a bell curve. You probably have 15% of your staff that adapted to the new reality pretty quickly, and that maybe 50% of your staff that came on board within a short period of time. But you may find yourself with another 40 to 50% of your staff that are still struggling on a daily basis to the changes that they're experiencing, because they just have more of a challenge adapting to change. What really hasn't changed about, through this time of chaos, is what staff really need from us as leaders. And this slide illustrates the four major components that Gallup tells us that staff want and need from their leaders. The first being trust. Trust is really key in leadership, especially during times of chaos and change. Clear and frequent communication becomes so essential, because there's so many unknowns that people, get distressed by the level of uncertainty. So it's important that although we don't know everything, we communicate what we do know, and understand that there'll be a lot of answers that you don't have, and that's part of the process. The second thing that staff will look for from their leaders during times of chaos and change is stability. We know that our staff really craves stability, and this is not a stable time. And while staff realize that you can't always predict the future, none of us can in this situation, they do need leaders that are not erratic in their decision making and their behavior. So, from a leadership standpoint, it's really important that you show up the same way in every single day, that your behavior doesn't become erratic. Staff also look to us to be very compassionate. Showing that you care and are appreciative is critical during this time, probably more than it's ever been. As staff is juggling new responsibilities, they have not only problems at work, but they have life problems at home as well. And they need to hear from their leaders that they understand, they're behind them, and that everyone is going to get through this situation together. Um, Compassion about their fears and their anxieties is really critical. And then the last thing that staff really need from their leaders is this idea about hope. Napoleon said that leaders are in fact dealers in hope. And that's especially true during a crisis situation. When we feel hope, we are more resilient, we're innovative, we're agile, and we have more confidence. I recently heard on a webinar, a perioperative leader talk about her staff keeps wanting to know, when is this going to be over? When is this going to be over? And she said, I've taken to say to them every day we are one day closer to the end. And just that they know that there's something on the other side of it, she said, is just so important, this idea about hope, because what we do know is that fear can be very contagious. So if your staff senses fear within you, they will feel it as well. Now, in part two, we're going to talk about a model. How do you really frame change and chaos as you're looking at coaching? And I think we have a model here with the circle of concern and the circle of influence that can serve as a very good guide. Because when we're coaching in a time of crisis, we want to stay within our circle of influence, because this is where we can really make our greatest progress towards our goals. And then we'll also review the Grow coaching model, which I have presented in other videos as well, but we'll look at specifically how we would use this in a time of chaos and change. When we think about what happens during a crisis and change, as I mentioned, a really good model to consider is this circle of influence model proposed by Dr. Stephen Covey, who really said that, you know, proactive, the point that he made was that if we want to be proactive in a crisis rather than reactive, you've got to focus on the things that you can control, which he called our circle of influence. And you can see it right in the middle. And the yellow circle in this slide is your circle of influence. What can you control? Well, you can control your behavior. You can control your attitude. You can control your words. And you can control your actions. But there are many things that are outside your circle of influence that he talks about as your circle of concern, that you have no control over, such as, when will this end? Will life ever be the same? Is my job stable? We worry about them, but we can't control them. So if we look at COVID-19 as an example of an extreme change and crisis in our circle of influence, we would want to stay within the yellow circle as we think about helping staff really look at goals to maybe reduce their stress, to reduce their anxiety, keep with goals that stay within this circle of influence, something that they can honestly do something about. Now, one widely used model that coaches use internationally is the GROW model. And I like it because not only is it an acronym that's easy to remember, the goals, reality, option, and a way forward, but we're going to also, in part three, we're going to use this model when we talk about our coaching example. So we'll actually walk through the model and how you would use it in this situation. Now, just as a reminder, when you're coaching, that there are 5 key coaching skills that you need to be attentive to that we have discussed in other modules. The first one is this idea to be fully present, which can be challenging during times of change and chaos because there are so many demands on your time. But what we do know is that one thing that really matters during times of chaos and change is leadership visibility. So this ability to not only be present, be visible, but to also stop and listen to what staff have to say. So active listening is a second core coaching skill. And as we've talked about before, that coaches should only do about 20% of the talking. So you should focus on allowing the staff member to talk for about 80% of the time. And if you find yourself doing all the talking, then it's time to really pull yourself back. Powerful questions, because we know that the power of coaching is really in the question. And the goal is to keep these questions very open ended and avoid questions like why questions that tend to put people on the defensive. And then direct communication, keep it open, clear. Maybe use some stories. And I think stories during a time like this are good, especially if you're a more seasoned leader and you've experienced other things. I think this idea about using stories to help, but just try to avoid trigger words too, like but and however. And then follow up accountability, as we've talked about. Any goals that you establish when you're coaching are goals that the staff member themselves need to own. These are not your goals to get out there and make happen. These are things that the staff member needs to do themselves. So in the last part of this video, we're going to kind of put all these skills into practice using a case example, and then talk a little bit about next steps, how you might want to just implement this into your leadership at this time. So here's our case scenario. I'm gonna pretend that you are a perioperative leader, and like many facilities across the country, your facility has canceled elective surgeries, and you're only doing emergency cases. Ordinarily, you're staffed to run 12 operating rooms, but you now only have 2 that are in use. Now, like many institutions, yours is worried about the financing because most are losing a lot of money during this time period. And you've had to give your perioperative staff one of 2 options. They either have to use their paid time off, and when that expires, they would have to be furloughed for a period of time, or they can elect to be redeployed to another clinical area. Now, keep in mind as we talk about this scenario, perioperative nursing has always been a very stable career choice. And it's really unusual that a periop nurse would ever be rotated out of the operating room. So this perioperative, as a perioperative nurse director, you have nurses that are really literally in shock that this is happening right now. So what you have offered to do is to make yourself available to coach staff as they think about these 2 options that you've offered them, to help them coach them through and ask them the kinds of questions they need to be considering as they think about what they want to do next. So we're going to use the coaching model, the GROW coaching model. And, the G in the model stands for goal. And that's where our coaching conversations really need to start, because we do need to mutually agree on what needs to happen, what needs to change, and get a really solid idea of what a good outcome would look like for the staff members. So in this situation with your perioperative staff, the goal is that they really do need to make a decision. Are they going to be redeployed or not, or choose not to be? And what are the ramifications if they choose that is the decision? So the goal would be to make a decision as to whether they're going to get deployed or not. The R in the model is the reality. What needs to be considered? What do they need to think about as they're making this decision, because time is a little bit of the essence. So what do they need to think about? Well, what concerns them? Are they concerned about their finances? That's something that's a very real concern that people have right now. Are they concerned about their own health and and safety, and maybe that of their elderly parents if they take care of them. You know, what will redeployment look like? What kinds of unexamined beliefs or assumptions or fears do they have about moving outside the operating room area? From there, we move to options. You know, what is the preferred option for the staff member in this situation? What would be the unintended consequences of any of the two options that they choose? And then if part of not wanting to get redeployed is fear, you know, what would happen if they really honestly believed that they could not fail? And then the W would be the way forward, and that would be the next steps. When will they make the decision? What does redeployment look like? You know, what could get in the way, and then what additional help does the nurse need from you? So that's an example of how you might coach in a very stressful situation where staff have to make an important decision about their own professional and personal lives as well. What we do know is that coaching really matters in a crisis. And, you know, there are four ways that I think as a leader coach, you can really help impact the outcomes that staff experience during a time of change. The first is that you can help your staff manage their own emotions and reactions by just asking them some good reflective questions that they can answer about the concerns that they have, like what matters to you most in this situation? What do you fear most about this? What are you most concerned about? And then the second would be that you can help staff maintain perspective about their own stress and anxiety. You know, both are expected during a time of crisis. But if you think about that circle of influence and circle of concern that we talked about on an earlier slide, you can bring that circle of influence and circle of concern. You can take that diagram, show it to staff, and talk about their circle of influence. What can they do within their circle of influence to reduce their own stress and anxiety? You can also foster connections and show empathy, because that's what great leaders do during crisis situations. They show empathy. And then maintain optimism. As we said, you know, that hope is so important. And if you lose optimism yourself in this situation, it's going to be extremely difficult for your staff to maintain their optimism. So what I'd urge you to do is just take the first step to get started on the journey. You know, it's all about getting started. Try coaching. You know, take a couple of staff members. You don't might not have to do this with everyone, but take a few staff members that you sense are really struggling, and really ask them some good questions about what they're feeling and how they're coping, and then really stay curious about their answers. Just don't jump right in, like we talked about on our last video, to be the advice monster to solve the problem. Stay curious, talk less, and listen more. And have the belief that staff can solve. They will come to their own solutions. You know, this whole idea about redeployment versus furlough, that's not a decision that you can make for a staff member. That's something that's a very personal decision that they have to make for themselves. And then I would say, lastly, don't get defensive if a staff member seems to be questioning how things are being managed by the organization. It's very common during crisis situations for staff to become very critical of what's happening or what's being done. And part of that critical nature, or part of that outlashing or that you sometimes see, or criticism that you hear, is being driven from a place of anxiety or fear. So that's something you can coach around too, by asking the question, tell me more about your concerns. When they start really being critical of maybe what the organization is doing, stop and say, okay, just tell me more about your concerns. So you're acknowledging that they have this anxiety and fear. Just a reminder that this is one of 10 in our video series. And so if you've watched the first three, there will be 7 more. And the number 3 through 10, you can really watch in any order and go back and rewatch if there's times that you really just need an update. And just in closing, I'd just like to encourage you to consider bringing the Nurse Leader Coach workshop on site for your leaders and emerging leaders. We can do up to 50 leaders in an all-day workshop. It's a very affordable way to provide a highly interactive leadership development experience for your staff. I've done this workshop at health systems throughout the country. And as part of the on-site workshop, I do a pre-assessment, an online pre-assessment of your leaders to really look at what their unique coaching challenges are so we can really tailor it. I also personally interview between 5 and 10 of your leaders to tailor our coaching scenarios that we would use to the content and needs of your leaders, what they're struggling with. So if you are interested, you can, I have my contact information on this slide. And I'd just like to thank you for watching the program.